Welcome to Reaction and welcome to Press Review, the show with the reaction editors where we pick the stories that have grabbed our attention in the last few days. I'm Ian Martin, editor of Reaction. I'm joined by my colleagues Maggie Pagano and by Alistair Ben. I think, Alistair, your first pick is from The Times and from James Forsyth writing about Tory turmoil.
Yeah, it's a typically forensic piece from Forsyth, sort of laying out the kind of dynamics around Boris and the parliamentary party, the Conservative Party, and um, how the kind of diary of events might affect challenges to Boris's leadership. So the publication of the Sue Gray reports, and then he kind of points towards local elections as potentially another crunch point in terms of getting enough letters in to
Yeah.
trigger a no confidence vote. And yeah, I just thought it laid out all the all the kind of swirling aspects to this in a detailed way. So yeah, and it just kind of it made me think a little bit about um, what how it could unfold. I mean, I think the Christian Wakefield defection, is there a chance that he did that in cahoots with Starmer to weaken the Tory plotters?
I think that's
To
probably, yeah, I think that's potentially a plot twist too far. And I think the defection, which should explain to viewers outside the UK or people in the UK who had best things to do than follow the extraordinary drama in the Commons this week, was that this is a Tory MP crossing the floor, as they say, and becoming a Labour MP. But it kind of backfired in a way, Alistair, I think, because it is the reality that MPs don't really like defections, don't really like defectors. People in the party that is getting the new MP obviously like the embarrassment that it causes their opponents, but generally it's seen as not not a proper parliamentary thing to do. So it did introduce an element of doubt actually, and sort of strengthened Boris in a way. But of course, it was then followed by David Davis's intervention. Some people think it wasn't devastating. I thought it was really an incredible moment of political theatre when he used Leo Amery's quote, of course, the quote famously against Chamberlain, which helped deliver Churchill the premiership in wartime, and in wartime in May 1940, an updated version of that, and I thought it was a very powerful moment. James's piece in the Times, he's essentially saying we're entering a bit of a calm after the intensity of the last 2 weeks. He's saying that essentially, while people are waiting for the great Sue Gray report, the denouement, there's a period of calm, but also that this whole crisis could carry on into the summer, even beyond the local election. So it's Boris, in my view, is essentially finished. Anything's possible with Boris, and he could carry on, but it feels to me as though the Tory tribe is done with him, but it might take some time. Maggie, what's your perspective? You had a pick from Conservative Home.
I did, from a loyal supporter of Boris. There's an article by David Campbell Bannerman, who former MEP, and he's putting the case for Boris, arguing why he should stay and why people should trust him. And I thought it was an incredibly weak piece because it was just sort of over the top, suggesting that people only ever voted for the Tories because of Boris and Brexit, whereas we all know that that's completely not true. In fact, at times during the campaign, they were trying to hide Boris, if you remember. But what I thought Campbell Bannerman missed was that it's like at the heart of any sort of reputational damage, whether it's a corporate, remember Deutsche Bank or BP, when they have those big disasters, it's very, very hard to retrieve that. And what Boris has done, by not apologizing, I still think he had a chance after that first Partygate, actually, the first one, if he'd come clean and said, look, we mucked up, whereas he's allowed it to drag on. And this ridiculous sort of something you've been going on about in the work event, finding excuses, just fessed up. And that would have been perhaps part of the Boris. So, yeah, people defending Boris at this stage.
Yeah.
Although I don't think he will go soon. I think, as Forsyth says, it's going to drag out. And with the COVID restrictions going, and if they can sort of do something big, like abandon some of the tax rises, who knows? Events, as Macmillan said famously.
But I think or social events, as as John Rentoul tweeted last week. I think I like and respect David Campbell Bannerman, but I just thought it had an intensity that made it inherently kind of implausible. Just this idea that this is the Boris who was apologising. I think, as you observed, Alistair, that this was David says that this is the authentic, genuine Boris, full of contrition and sincerity. Did you buy that?
No.
Exactly.
It was it's sort of a laughable thing to say, but you can see why someone would say that. It's you're trying to defend
Indefensible.
Boris. You're trying to make some argument, and you point to his achievements, and you say, well, actually, there is an interpretation here which goes against the grain of what people have been saying. That I think that there is a little bit of a weird thing going on in some aspects of the debates. People now going, oh, it's all a bit much about it. We're still talking about a party. What 2 years after it happened, or a year after it happened, it's all a bit overkill. You can't get rid of a prime minister because of a party, and you can understand why that sounds like a plausible thing to say. But the reason why people are annoyed at Boris is not just because he walked into that garden and glad-handed people. It's not simply that there was rule breaking. It's that Boris is not a good prime minister who has presided over a shambolic operation at the heart of government for far too long, and has been slowly being isolated for about a year from allies and from people who might help him out. And he doesn't have the support, and there are lots of good reasons for getting rid of him that aren't just, oh well, he broke the rules and there was hypocrisy, because that is just one part of it.
I mean, he may survive, but I'm very struck spending a lot of time at Westminster in the last week and chatting to a lot of Tory MPs and journalists as well, and it just feels to me as though, I could be wrong, but it feels to me like an ERM style event, one of those moments in politics where essentially you can feel public opinion shift and settle into a new sort of settled will. And it just feels to me, and you look at his numbers and what's coming out of the focus groups, which we discussed a bit last week, and it just feels as though people have really had enough, and have had enough of the fibbing and the contortions which his supporters have to tie themselves into to excuse the as I said earlier, the kind of inherent implausibility of his position and his denials. I mean, there's also the difficulty for Boris, and he does have supporters in the press. The Daily Mail was hugely supportive of him this week, treating the castigating the plotters, really going for it. But it's not as though the government has. I think foreign policy. I think government is actually doing quite well at the moment. We'll come on to Ukraine in a moment. But beyond that immediate crisis, it's not as though his defenders are saying, look, you cannot remove this great man because he has some fantastic plan for government, or some agenda, Maggie, some brilliant economic policy or series of reforms that he's working towards, which mean do not interrupt this great leader who's made a few mistakes, because there is great work underway. It doesn't feel like that, does it?
No, it doesn't. It's actually the reverse of that. And some people are suggesting that, he has maybe a chance if he were to drop some of the policies that he's put through, such as
tax rises and stuff,
particularly the national insurance rise, which would come at a terrible time for people suffering a much higher cost of living. Yeah.
But I think that's where the story may go actually in the next, or one of the directions in which the story will go in the next few days and weeks is, and this is tough for Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, as well, is that I think you'll start to see, we've already seen some newspaper columnists start to lambast the government, like Alistair Heath and the Telegraph, on the question of tax rises. And I think you'll see more and more calls from centre-right commentators and from Tory MPs for those tax rises to be suspended, delayed, halted. Very difficult for Sunak to do, because that's essentially unpicking, unpicking budget and a whole financial settlement and tax plan. But he may come under a lot of pressure to do it. I think we're going to move on to my first pick, which is by the great Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal this week, writing about what's happening to Biden. And I'd love to hear your view. We'll talk about Ukraine in a moment as well, but it's broader than that. She's reflecting on the fact that it's exactly 50 years ago since Biden's incredible political career began, determined to become the president, and did, written off so many times, and very old to get the job, but still he did become the president. And she's reflecting on this question of him just appearing tired, done. And it's 50 years ago. She notes that he was just an obscure Delaware county councilman, 29. She says, a dashing, charismatic nobody. And he ran against the Republican, this is a great name, Republican J. Caleb Boggs, was running for his third term in the Senate. And Boggs was beloved in Delaware, former governor, Republican moderate who voted for the 64 and 68 Civil Rights Acts. And no one would challenge him. And he seemed unbeatable, other than the young Biden thought, as she says, looked at him and thought he's tired, by which he meant he's old, 63, which, as she says, seemed older then than now. And he did it. And it was this great upset of 1972, beats Boggs by 1.5 points. And the great career began. And as she says, themes repeat themselves in life. What goes around comes around. And politics is a rough old business. The thing with Biden now is essentially, he looks tired. That thing that he said of Boggs. I mean, Maggie, does it look to you? Is that exaggerated, or does it look like Biden is done? I mean, I find it very hard to imagine him even being able to run for a second term.
Oh, second term? Good Lord! I think he's got to get through this first term.
Yeah,
that's very optimistic. Well, I saw the clip where he was talking about Ukraine and Russia yesterday, and I thought that he looked very, actually quite sort of naive. Who was it who said he carries a big stick? And he was sort of, threatening economic sanctions. He doesn't know we're going to punish him. And it all sounded a bit passé, because we know exactly that that's not how it quite happens. And I thought, his comments about, which have caused all the fuss, that a minor incursion, it was all very insensitive. And you do feel that maybe in the background they could have been a little bit smarter about this, because there are some not concessions, but maybe, and Putin this morning is saying withdraw from Romania, withdraw from Bulgaria. We know what it is that makes Putin so unhappy, or so insecure. And one just feels that the diplomatic behind the scenes has not been very, very effective, or clearly not.
Yeah, there's a great piece by Tim Marshall, Reaction columnist, on the site today for members of Reaction to read. I should say, if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to become a member of Reaction, go to the site again. The address is below, and you get my weekly newsletter. Goes out on a Saturday morning. Maggie's brilliant column on business. Loads more from the team, and Tim Marshall every week, every Friday on geopolitics. Now, yeah, I found the quote from Biden, which was in a long press conference. So this was him actually being out front, taking on the press, taking on the challenge, talking about the second year of his presidency, about wanting to be outside Washington and meet the people and sort of re-energize things. All sounded rather desperate. But that clip, minor incursion, that's a diplomat's nightmare, and it can be extracted and taken slightly out of context, but it's calamitous because it just suggests that the president is not in full control of his faculties and not aware how dangerous that remark is, because you've already got a divided Europe, Germany desperate to avoid any conflict with Russia, Britain flying arms and support to Ukraine, and Britain being, for all that Britain is condemned by its critics internally and abroad as having gone somehow isolationist post Brexit, it's Britain that's actually, via the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and the efforts of the Foreign Secretary and Number 10, that is aiding the Ukrainians and has been really, really clear and robust on this. But the rest of Europe seems divided. So to then just give Putin evidence that, well, a minor incursion or some foray across the border under a pretext, which is what dictators tend to do, isn't it? They tend to sort of find some kind of excuse for launching an action. That was used in several cases at the start of the Second World War. To just give him a chance to do that is, I find that really frightening, that the President of the United States, who the West should be able to look to for leadership, is basically all over the place. Yeah, my second pick was just capturing that, and the link is below, was the best account of the blowback, and the response was, I think, in the Washington Post, a report from Paul Son, ex-Wall Street Journal guy, and Tyler Pager, headlined "Biden's Ukraine comments prompt uproar at home and abroad." So it's the last thing you want. It's the last thing you want from the US president at a moment of extreme tension.
Ian, sorry, could I add something to your comment about how a lot of people were saying Britain isolationist, and in fact, we're the one in Europe. But I mean, what has been quite striking about the last few weeks is the way that we are working very closely with the Finns, with the Swedes, with the Poles, with the Netherlands. Actually, you can see sort of Germany and France to some extent both isolating themselves for different reasons, but we are actually bringing together, and the Baltics, northern states. It's very interesting to see that sort of geographic picture emerging.
Yeah, the tragedy of it is, I mean, I wrote for the Times this week on this subject. The tragedy, and Europe's tragedy, is that it's inherently divided, even despite the experience of the 20th century, the disaster of the 20th century. We still find ourselves in this position where we cannot organize ourselves collectively as a continent to face down dictators or organize secure energy supplies. Now, anti-Brexiteers will say, and people who voted Remain will say quite rightly, well, there was this thing called the European Union, we were part of that. But it can't be the European Union, certainly not now, because the UK, a major European defence power and the primary intelligence power in Europe, is not in the EU. But even when we were, it's not really a coherent thing or a serious proposition that the EU is the forum for dealing with defence, has a security policy, but defence policy. That's something which countries do via NATO, or increasingly NATO, which the Swedes and the Finns are not in, bilaterally, by getting as close to the British as possible. It just seems to me odd. I don't have the answer, but there just seems to be no proper forum for all European governments, non-EU and EU, to get together and agree some cooperation and collaboration on what's a dangerous moment. What's your thinking, Alistair, on the Putin question, which Tim Marshall wrote about for Reaction, and it seems as though we are potentially on the brink of war.
I think we're constrained in sort of a more fundamental respect than simply not getting the machinery to sort of align or to sort of work. In that, it's a bit, maybe the point of these sort of podcasts is to make silly historical comparisons, which get people thinking. But I was reading the other day about Cardinal Richelieu and Ferdinand II and all that, and the degree to which the Holy Roman Empire couldn't, was kind of discombobulated during the 30 Years' War by someone who was, effectively organized around a national strategic interest and was quite ruthless in protecting it. And there's a sort of continual back and forth where Richelieu is sort of identifying opportunities and sort of justifying what he's doing in quite nifty terms. That it's very cynical, but ultimately kind of gets what he wants, and you can judge him by that or not. So saying that, with Putin and the way we often misread Russia, in the sense that Russia does feel threatened along its borders. That is a fact. It has felt like that for decades, if not hundreds of years. It is a real fear in Russian kind of policy making. Some of it has been justified. It's a massively porous country with only a few strategic sort of exit points. So that's always there. And we sort of we always tend to misread because we think we're wedded to a kind of Wilsonian idea that actors can only really act well if their sort of moral and ethical standing is aligned with their kind of public-facing policymaking thing. And if they're not, they're just seen as authoritarian people who are always acting cynically. And it's that's actually a really bad way of trying to think about Putin and the kind of complexities of Russian life and the kind of shifting objectives that are kind of located. You see
it. That's not a silly historical comparison at all. It's a really good historical comparison, but you see it in some of the commentary assessing this from the perspective of Putin, that, well, look, it's not in his economic interests, though actually he's piled up so much gold that he probably is insulated, certainly from the short-term effects of an economic crisis which would follow a proper war or an invasion of Ukraine. But that's not necessarily how he thinks. I mean, he's a Russian leader. I mean, it's people do things which are not in their direct economic interest because they're in their bigger, perceived to be in their bigger, broader strategic to their benefit. But we in our soft Western way think, well, diplomacy will, economic clout, sanctions will make him see reason. But he's viewing this from a completely different and very Russian perspective. I suspect we're going to be talking a lot more about this, aren't we, next week, actually? And it's the biggest story around, bigger than what's happening to Boris, I would contend. Now, Maggie, your next pick is Jeremy Warne with some good news from the Daily Telegraph.
Absolutely. Jeremy, who I don't think we could say is perhaps the most optimistic glass half full type of economics writer. But anyway, he's
a great commentator. Great commentator.
Great commentator, absolutely brilliant. And he's always quite cautious and skeptical. But the headline on his piece today is "Whisper it, but we may have reached peak misery." And he says this because there is a well-known in economics, a misery index, which the most miserable is when you have high unemployment and high inflation. And he points out, although the misery index is sort of tipping there, getting quite high, actually we have the high inflation, but we have an incredibly low unemployment, in fact, a very tight labor market. So that he's not quite saying inflation is transitory, but he's suggesting, and this is one of the reasons why the Bank of England has been slow to act with interest rates. It doesn't want to dampen that demand. It doesn't want to stop companies employing people because, and as we saw this morning, actually, it was Friday, the new ONS numbers for December is the biggest fall since 1996.
On retail sales.
The retail sales over the Christmas period, which is no surprise. People weren't going out, they weren't going to parties, or most people weren't going to parties. And there is a lot of pent-up demand. So what he's saying is, let's be very, very careful. At the moment, the biggest spurt to price rises has been energy, which is obviously feeding through to everything else because the costs of manufacturing go up. But he's sort of saying, there's light at the end of the tunnel. So worth reading.
It's interesting. Simon French, who writes for the Times, city economist, he was making the point that actually the numbers, yes, that's disappointing on the retail sales number, but just look out for a shift in consumer behavior as consumers who've bought lots of stuff during lockdown and during restrictions are now switching to spending more on services and experiences, if you like. I think Phil Aldrich from Bloomberg made the point that in response to these numbers that he personally feels he's got enough stuff. He wants to go to more gigs and live events.
And you can see that in the sales. Fashion sales slumped by about 8%, and so did petrol and diesel sales. People weren't going to parties, weren't going out, so they spent more on food, which is only down 1%. So people have changed their portfolio. And as you're right, now they've got all this stuff. Time to get out and party.
I mean, how do you feel, Maggie? Just quickly on the economic prospects. There are these tax rises coming, which we mentioned earlier. There is a squeeze coming. Ed Conway wrote about it. The Sky's economics editor wrote about it this week, and had crunched the numbers, crunched the data on just how severe that squeeze is going to be for a lot of households, starting about now and running through the spring. That's going to be the real backdrop to all this political crisis. I wonder if in the end actually that might not be what tips Boris over the edge, if there is public anger about people feeling inherently poorer.
Absolutely. And I sort of think that there is a case for Rishi Sunak to say, well, actually, growth is not looking too bad. The economy, we've got the restrictions dropping now end of January. Demand is there. We know that there's 200 billion sitting in people's accounts around the place, that actually let's postpone that increase in national insurance. I don't think that's impossible at all. And we are predicted OECD 4.9%, I think, growth this year, fastest in the OECD. That would be a way of building up confidence. Just say, when the facts change, I change my mind.
Tax rises. That'd be really difficult for him to do, but I think there's going to be a lot of pressure. Tax rises. A lot of pressure on him. Crazy idea in the current climate. I think the final pick, Alistair, this week is something completely different. It's on cricket.
Yeah, it's the Amazon Prime documentary Shane, which is about Shane Warne, which is going to go onto Amazon for Prime subscribers. It's going to be, I think, free from next week. So it's going to be available on Prime. And it's just a bit of a light relief, really. It's a very straightforward sports documentary, pretty straightforward, sort of panegyric for Shane Warne, just about the kind of, he's just a cricketer with a love for life, and everything that he did. I mean, that's the thrust of the documentary, is just like he was just a cricketer who loved beers and smoking. And everything else that went sort of wrong in his career was because of his naivety, or a kind of just that happy-go-lucky thing which just went wrong. Apart from one bit where it talks about his affairs, which is actually really heartbreaking in terms of like the effects on his children and his wife, and And then there is a kind of moment of reflection from Shane where he talks about how, you know, he would just, during the 2005 Ashes, would just spend all night drinking in his hotel room on his own, just because it unfolded just before the series. Something I was not aware of at all at the age of 10 when I watched that series, but cast it in a new light, actually. So it's worth, for all cricket fans who want a bit of cheering up after the Ashes, and a kind of a bit of a message of what cricket can do, and you know, and the kind of more positive stories about cricket and culture is worth a watch.
Yeah, so for those who are not big cricket fans, and so I must admit, when I saw the documentary called Shane, I wondered whether it was about the actor Paul Shane or Shane Ritchie or any other Shane. But what is it about him which makes him such a compelling, fascinating figure for cricket fans?
In the same way as someone like Andrew Flintoff is a compelling character, because cricket is the most individual of team games, in that you can have great players who are, you know, truly great players who play in bad teams where the team does lose a lot, because it's a very tough, especially a test cricket. You can't, over a 5-day period with all the components that are in play in a game of cricket, you know, it's pretty hard for one person to you know, someone can stand out like Joe Root, you know, England captain of the last year, has had an extraordinary year, one of the best calendar years in terms of run scoring ever, and yet England have lost the majority of the games they played in. But what's interesting about someone like Warne, Botham in England, Flintoff to an extent, was that they were able to, as individuals, turn the course of matches, repeat, and not just do it once, do it over a sustained period. And the character, you know, the character that allows you to do that is interesting, and it's interesting from not from just a sports fan. It's interesting because it gives you really interesting lessons about what success means, what costs it exerts on people's families and on your personality. You definitely see it with Warne. That single-mindedness is not always helpful when you're in other domains of life, for example.
Yeah, there's a fashion. There is a fashion for this, isn't there, Alistair, of sports documentaries. I think, I don't watch a lot of them, but they seem to be getting better. The Ferguson documentary, which was, I can't remember whether it was Netflix or Amazon Prime, but which if you haven't watched it, I really recommend. It's about, yes, of course, it's about football, but it's also about the west of Scotland. It's about the culture of sport. It's about money. It's about emotional intelligence, the sacrifices made. This sounds, and I will watch it. Shane. It sounds like a similar kind of venture to get beyond, and it's maybe just because there's so much capacity now with streaming and so much hunger for material and so much money being spent, that you can actually zero in on a personality like that and make something that goes a lot deeper than just the standard TV or radio sports feature, which declares everything to be wonderful or exciting, or something with a longer attention span.
Also, if you look at something, I might have spoken about this on this podcast. I don't know. Is the documentary Hoop Dreams, which came out in the 90s. It's about two teenagers trying to get in like Chicago, both trying to, you know, they had a dream to play in the NBA. And it's kind of, the documentary, it just starts with that simple premise. It's a fly on the wall documentary that goes over several years. It's a simple premise that both of them at the age of 11 or 12 sort of say to camera, I want to play in the NBA. And then the whole thing unfolds from them, you know, sort of trying to pursue that, and a whole massive story about race and class in America unfolds around them. It's an amazing piece of documentary making, and best thing I've seen about sport. But that's what I think, that there's a lot of really good sports documentaries out there. The problem with something like Shane is you do get a little bit of insight, but it does get slightly lost in this one, in the kind of the kind of montage elements of sports documentaries where you sort of have pieces of outrageous skill just cut with people saying how great they were at sport. And that's not really what people are interested in. But the thing I would love to see more of is these kinds of, talking about musicians or novelists or whoever, and doing a bit more kind of focus on kind of individuals and building a story around them, because I think
But I agree.
lost.
I agree with you, and I think this is one of the baffling failures of the streaming revolution, that there isn't more of that. I mean, a documentary I
There
would
is the odd
recommend.
one.
There's some, but actually, if you go to documentaries, maybe it's just audience taste that's a minority pursuit. But if you go to documentaries on Netflix or Amazon Prime, you'll find some things, but you find a lot of absolute dross. I mean, the tens of billions that are being spent on big production drama, so $10 million an episode, $10 million an episode for Succession, that it doesn't seem to be being directed towards documentaries, but maybe those are just their minority pursuits, and maybe that's what some people would say you need the BBC for. I would flag up one which is on Netflix, I think, which is Echoes in the Canyon, which is Jacob Dylan's documentary about Californian music in the 1960s. That's a documentary I would highlight and recommend. But I think we're going to wrap things up there this week for Press Review, which is the show where Reaction editors, I'm Ian Martin, joined by Maggie Pagano, Alistair Ben, my Reaction colleagues, where we pick the stories, and as you heard, they're documentaries and bits of media that have grabbed our attention in the last few days. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just click the subscribe button below. And also, if you want to become a member of Reaction, where you get my weekly newsletter on politics and economics and all sorts of other things, Maggie's brilliant column on business. You also get Tim Marshall on geopolitics, who writes exclusively for members every Friday, and loads more from the team. Then the details are below. It's really easy to subscribe. And until next time, thank you for listening and thank you for watching.